this, the third webinar in the series brought to you by the Three Counties Cider and Perry Association. We've already had two. Apologies, somebody managed to mute me then. Oh, that's quite impressive. I didn't even do that myself. Anyway, we've already had great sessions around social media and around licensing, and this, the third one, is all about labeling requirements and processes and legalities. So it's going to be a very, very useful session. There's a lot of you who are here because not only is it are there some important elements that can help getting labels right from an aesthetic point of view, there are legal requirements that you have to ensure that you are undertaking in order for your products to be compliant. Before I wish on any further, Simon Day, as chair of the Three Counties Cider and Perry Association, did you want to say anything, or just a hello and goodbye again?
A big hello.
Yeah.
Can you? I've got really dodgy internet here for some reason today, and everything keeps freezing on me, so I hope you can hear me. But yeah, big hello from the Three Counties Cider and Perry Association. Thanks for joining us. As Gabe said, number 3 in a series ongoing, so do keep coming back. If you're not members, do consider joining us for a measly sum of £15 a year. You get all of this sort of thing and a lot more indeed. Lots of educational and networking opportunities. Anyway, I'll hand back over to Gabe, and a big thanks to Richard and I'm trying to see Bob is there. Yes, Bob.
Yeah.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Lorraine. Excellent. Looking forward to this one.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Simon. So, so today we've got a fairly stellar lineup of experts who are going to guide us through. We've got Richard Alsop, who's the Principal Trading Standards Officer for Herefordshire Council. We've got Bob Price, Policy Advisor from the National Association of Cider Makers, and Lorraine Boddington, who is the, I suppose, must be relatively new chair of the Pomology and Tech Committees at the NACM. So thank you all for sparing your time. And so we're going to dive straight into things. If anybody's got questions at any time, we will take them on board. If it's, especially if it's something that's sort of pertinent to the flow of the conversation. If there's something that is you think that might be a little bit more long-winded or very specific, maybe we'll try and pick that up at the end, or indeed even pick it up offline, because it's amazing how quickly an hour goes, and we've got about an hour to undertake all of this. So Richard Alsop, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first of all, just to give us a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of sort of labeling 101 from a legal requirement point of view. Anybody who was looking to create for the first time a bottle of cider, what are the key fundamental things that they need to account for when going through that process?
Okay, well, from a labelling perspective, and that's what I'm restricting to myself here, it's really, you'll be pleased to hear, it's really very simple. It's people who make things complicated with labelling by trying to put things on a label that perhaps shouldn't be there or are potentially misleading. So the basics are, number 1, a true name of the food. Some people might just think, well, cider's cider. I would always encourage people to say, is it still, sparkling, sweet, medium sweet? Although, of course, we all know there is no criterion for judging whether something is medium sweet, or at least not to my knowledge. So try and make, you can have a fancy name with the cider, of course, you know, and I've seen plenty of those. People can be creative with a fancy name, but somewhere on the product, there needs to be a descriptor that adequately describes it, and if possible, distinguishes it from other ciders that you are selling yourself. So, for example, your sweet cider, or so let's go the other end of the spectrum, your dry cider might actually be someone else's medium dry. Now, we can't really account for that because it's well, it's not completely subjective, and I'm sure there could be some scientific rationale for working out whether something is dry, medium sweet, or sweet, but I'm not aware of that. So if you might do a dry cider and you add some sugar, or you've used a sweeter apple variety, and you've got a slightly sweeter one. Well, at least within your range of ciders, distinguish one from the other. That's, to me, that just sounds like almost stating the blindingly obvious. But so unless there's questions on that, and there may be questions on some of the names that ciders call. But moving on, the next one is obviously the volume. Okay, in metric, please. I don't think I've seen a cider sold in fluid ounces for many a decade, but you never know. Somebody might want to make a stand. I think technically you can still do both. But anyway, let's leave that aside. Volume declaration. Just make sure if it's over 200 mils that the height of the figures that you use, okay, the height of the figures, so if it's 250, the height of those figures is at least 4 millimeters high. Again, that's quite small. Most of you would probably have a slightly larger volume declaration on that because you want people to know how much they're getting for their buck. Third one is obviously the ABV. The password, which I certainly didn't need for this webinar, was in the incorrect format, Gabe.
and that was on purpose. You saw
yes,
the trick,
of course it was. So please, I know some people think, oh, come on, an ABV declaration is an ABV declaration, but there is a correct format, and it is the figure. So taking Gabe's password, it's 6.9% vol. Just vol, not volume, V-O-L. You can put in front the word alcohol, in front of the figure, that is, the word alcohol or the abbreviation ALC, A-L-C. But actually, you shouldn't even use ABV. That shouldn't really, it's no need for it to appear on your product.
Right.
I've seen products that have it, do it two different ways. And I think I can't be bothered to get, you know, finicky about that, as long as somewhere the alcohol declaration is in the correct format so that we don't confuse stupid people. That's probably the argument that might be used there. Hope that doesn't sound too patronizing. Just it's an important metric for your product, so you need to get it in the right format so people can compare and contrast, basically. And those three things, by the way, the true name of the food, the alcohol declaration, and the volume declaration all need to appear in the same field of vision. You can see the common sense of that. When people see something on a shelf, they're going to want to know what it is, how much they're going to get, and how strong it is. So those three things have got to be in the same field of vision. It can be on the back label or the front label. That's important. It doesn't say it has to be on the front label. So you need to work out, if you imagine your product is on a shelf, are you happy for people just to see the name of the food on the front or a fancy name on the front and have to pick the bottle off the shelf to turn it around to see exactly what it is and how strong it is? You probably guess how much is there because cider comes in fairly standard, you know, volumes, doesn't it? But you wouldn't know how strong it was. So that's a sort of a decision that as long as you stick to the guidelines that it has to be in the same field of vision. Now, those are, you know that cider does not need a best before date, all right? You can put a best before date by all means, and I see no problem with that. You wouldn't necessarily, cider may last, some ciders will last for years, I'm sure, until they're opened, but it's one way of effectively batch coding. So I would argue, but not with legal authority, that it would be best practice to use a best before date. But there are other ways of batch coding. You do need to have something on your product so that it can be identified. Okay, if I picked just imagine I'm finding a bottle in a shop, I then take it to you and I say, right, when did you produce this? What fermentation vessel did it come from? I could actually, and certainly for PGI, I do need to go into that sort of detail. I very rarely find non-conformities, but nevertheless, I need to make sure there's a system in place. So your production record, the batch number on your product should relate back to your production records so that everything, if need be, is transparent.
Super.
As far as mandatory information, that's pretty much it. I'm not going to go into the units of alcohol because I don't know too much about that, and it is still advisory, okay? The responsible alcohol campaign, blah, 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 is encouraging people to do that, but it takes up space, and if for whatever reason you don't want to put it there, well, no one's going to come knocking on your door saying, how many units are in here? I think that's important to emphasise.
Well, we will get a clear and concise update from Mr. Price on that in a moment, if that's all right, Bob.
Yes, absolutely.
We will be coming to that, Bob and Lorraine.
Gabe, just quickly to finish off, I do apologise. I missed out a very obvious other mandatory requirement, and that is an address. Okay, now the practice is, it's been interpreted that address only needs to be a postcode. So the name of the manufacturer, it can actually be the name of the seller, of course, because there's contract packing, as people making ciders for Waitrose, say, whatever, but there has to be someone who's taking responsibility for that product. And for most craft cider makers, that's going to be the person who made it, obviously. So a company name, doesn't have to be a limited company name, because some people are sole traders, but you need some company name, doesn't have to be your own personal name, okay? It's just a trading name, plus the minimum is a postcode. Now, many Herefordshire cider makers, even if they haven't gone down the PGI route, would like to have Herefordshire in the address. Well, fine, put Herefordshire in the address. I've checked with DEFRA, just because you could even say this product, I don't like to encourage it, is produced in Herefordshire, or made in Herefordshire, or made out of Herefordshire apples. That will not fall foul of the PGI rules, according to DEFRA. They've taken a much stricter, narrower view of the PGI, and the PGI, the 6 of them, as we all know, for the 3 counties, cider and perry, and for Herefordshire, it is Herefordshire cider. You have to use that name. I mean, I have accidentally, I think, PGI'd a product from a company, and I'm not going to say who it was, and it didn't anywhere on the bottle actually say Herefordshire cider. Well, that was a mistake I made, and I suspect it was a mistake by the marketing team. Oh yes, we wanted this PGI because it is a Herefordshire cider, but they didn't even use the protected name. So we've got true name of the food, alcohol declaration, volume, and address, and some kind of batch number. So that is it for mandatory stuff. Unless was it Bob? Unless I've missed something, and Bob can come in. Was it Bob?
Yeah.
Was that a good summary, Bob? Roughly?
Sorry.
Did you like that summary? Was that okay for you?
Yeah, I think you might have missed a couple of points, which from a food perspective isn't so important anymore, because as we don't have an ingredient list panel, we therefore don't put in bold artificial sweeteners or allergens. So without listing,
can I come in on that, Bob?
Yeah,
quite right. I didn't mention ingredients because, of course, for alcoholic, drinks over, it's either 1.2 or 1.3. I can't remember now. ABV, it's 1.2. It is not compulsory to have an ingredients list. Now that's important, okay? If you voluntarily do an ingredients list, then I can go on to how you do that, because once you voluntarily put an ingredients list on, it has to comply in the way that a mandatory ingredients list would. So you would have to embolden any, and in cider it's mainly sulfites, isn't it? I can't imagine, unless someone's gone for some wacky squid flavored cider, that there's any other common allergens that might appear in a cider. But you know, there could be some beer cider hybrids out there, I don't know.
Yeah.
So if you have an ingredients list, yes, it has to be in the correct format, the largest ingredient first, down to the smallest. And if an allergen appears in that list, it must be highlighted in some way. It doesn't have to be bold. It can be in pink or something, italics, whatever. It's got to stand out from the other ingredients. If you do decide not to have an ingredients list, then your only requirement in relation to saying what's in there is if an allergen appears in your product, even if though you don't have an ingredients list, you have to have the contains sulfite statement. So sorry, I did miss that out, Bob. Does that cover that? And by the way, just to one extra thing on that, there was one cider maker. I think they were, I can't remember who it was, and even if I could, I wouldn't say, obviously, who quite innocently had put an ingredients list. I said, okay, that's great. Yeah, that's apple juice, sulfites. That's it. You haven't had to dilute that. Oh yeah, I did actually have to dilute it a bit from, 7.2 because it fermented out quite strong. So I've diluted it back to say 5.6, a more marketable strength for me. Well, then that water becomes an ingredient. Okay, that water then becomes an ingredient. I'm only talking about if you voluntarily choose to put an ingredients list on there, okay? You voluntarily do. Yeast, by the way, is not an ingredient. So I don't want to see yeast on any voluntary ingredients list because yeast is known as a processing aid. There may well be some yeast left in the product at the end, but it's not serving any technological function. So it's regarded in the finished product. So you can't make cider without yeast, but it's known as a processing aid. It's not an ingredient.
Okay.
Okay. I think
just very quickly before you chime in, Bob, Richard, the allergens that you mentioned as potential, sulfites being by far the most common.
Yeah.
If I have heard instances of 1 or 2 cider makers, not in the UK actually, utilizing isinglass fining agents, very, very rare in the UK. Just to clarify where those lists of allergens can be found, so everybody knows what they potentially are, where they can be found. Do we know that?
If anyone wants to, there's 14 allergens. I mean, people could be, I've said this to many people, so forgive me if you've heard this before, but people can be allergic to anything, obviously. Hard work, tomatoes, rain. There's 14 named allergens that you have to be aware of. 14. I mentioned squid earlier. That wasn't a joke. It's quite serious because mollusks are one of the 14. Yeah. Okay, so if you get a bit of tentacle in your tipple, it needs to be declared, and I'm quite strict about that. So if you Google FSA, which stands for the Food Standards Agency, 14 allergens, you'll find it on Google straight away. It's not a difficult list, and there's 14 of them. Okay.
Super. Richard, thank you so much. I'm going to mute you, metaphorically speaking.
That's fine. I'll mute myself. I'll mute myself.
Metaphorically, just for a second, just for feedback purposes. But that's a really nice summary of key elements. Bob and Lorraine, is there anything? We might as well explore ingredients as we're in this territory.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about.
Said. Tony's asked a question, what about E-numbers? So I think Tony wants an answer.
Right.
My view would be that, what does the question really mean? Is he saying, can I put the E number in instead of the proper name of the ingredients? Well, you can put the E number or the name of the ingredients if you're going the list of ingredient route. So it's up to you.
Mandatory if you've got airline.
Sorry, Tony, we're losing you there a bit.
Sorry. So if you go on Wikipedia, you can see that malic acid is E296. So it said it has to be listed in the food ingredient, but if that's only if it's optional, as you said. Is that right?
Can I come back on that?
Yeah, go on.
As I say, the rules are on additives. Okay, we all know what an additive is. It's something you wouldn't eat in its own right. Okay, it's added to food to perform, a technological function, whether that's sweetening, stabilizing, emulsifying. There's any number of them. Okay, the rule is if you do this voluntary ingredient list, you have to use the additive category name, which is basically what it's doing. Is it an artificial sweetener? What is it? And then either the E number or the actual name of the additive.
Oh, okay.
Is that clear? So
that's only if you want to add a list. It's not mandatory.
Not at all. I must make that clear. You don't need to list additives on their own like you would. You have to have a standalone statement contains sulfites or any allergen. You can't avoid telling people there's an allergen in your product, whether you've got an ingredient list or not. But if you do voluntarily, you'd simply have to the name of the category of additive, emulsifier, sweetener, whatever, then either the name or the E number. Don't clog up your label by putting both. If people don't know what E102 is, well, they'll have to look it up. And if people want to know what E number for malic acid or something, well, they'll have to look that up. You do not have to put both. So it just, yeah.
E296, well, there we go.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I'll mute myself again.
Thank you, Tony. That was a good question there. Phil, we will come on to your question in a moment. But Bob, if you could we continue to explore ingredients labeling, whether there's any likelihood of change, and as we go through the Brexit process, etc., etc.
Okay, the laws in Britain are the laws which the European Union have given us. After the 1st of January 2021, those laws will still apply because we in the UK have done nothing to change them. So for all the laws that are on the statute books, they carry forward. It will take an act of parliament or a statutory instrument to amend existing law. So we have a situation that legally we do not have to put an ingredient panel on our products. We don't have to declare ingredients or anything like that. Now, in the EU, it requires the Commission to make a proposal, the European Parliament agree it, and a whole basis of negotiation to take place before any change to the existing regulations can occur. But since we've taken back control of our legal processes in the UK, England can introduce new ingredient laws when it feels like it. So can Wales, so can Scotland, and so can Northern Ireland, because that type of legislation is the remit of the devolved administrations. So you can have a situation where each four of the devolved administrations can require different labelling panels, different labelling content, that type of thing. So that's something to look out for. However, it's been an unsatisfactory situation for a long time by consumers, by health lobbies, that alcohol doesn't have to declare an ingredient list. And there's a lot of pressure building up on industry to do that. So a number of companies in the alcoholic drinks industry have agreed to introduce themselves voluntary labelling declarations, either on pack or on websites. But I think the preference is to put it on pack, and you'll find that the brewers will be leading the way on this, and a number of European brewers are doing this as well. So you will find in the not too distant future, because you've got label changes and everything else to get through, products appearing, mainstream cider brands, mainstream beer brands, having an ingredient declaration and also a nutrition information declaration. But that will be limited to the energy content, the calorific value. So that will be coming in. And the pressure will be growing for more and more companies to do that. But the leading cider makers and the leading brewers will be doing that.
Super. Okay, so it's a point of status quo, effectively, that nothing particularly different is going to be happening for the foreseeable future, and obviously the NACM will keep us fully up to all three counties members and everybody else as and when the potential opportunity for change arises. Lorraine, I've got a couple of sort of slightly more technical questions for you, if that's okay, or Bob, if either of you is appropriate. There was a question, so can cider be an ingredient on an ingredients list for cider? So if it was, some people might want to call their, maybe because there is quite a large amount of water within certain based ciders, they might wish to call that the primary ingredient of their product cider, to which they have then added small amounts of water, some sugar, some acid, etc. Is that allowable, or does it have to be water and apple juice rather, or sorry, just apple juice as the primary ingredient?
I will lead off. Lorraine has a history with this because I remember when Basil Jarvis was chair of the technical committee many years ago, and Lorraine was working with him. Basil put forward at a European cider meeting that the ingredient panel should actually list up cider as the principal ingredient for cider, and he had a very wonderful justification of why that should be so. That was many years ago. I'd say that's probably about 15 or 20 years ago. Things have moved on a bit, but it doesn't make it that much clearer. There is a preference by some companies that since the principal ingredient is a fermented cider base, they would prefer to have fermented cider base on their label. Others might prefer to have fermented apple juice as the principal cider ingredient. I am in discussion with our primary authority, which is Devon, Somerset and Torbay, to get acceptance for both as an acceptable means of defining the product, because essentially apple juice is transformed through a process into a fermented product, after which something else happens to finish it off as cider.
Interesting.
I know.
Interesting. It's whether I suppose anybody who puts again, not that it's mandatory because it's not, but how many brewers would put down beer as their primary ingredient rather than water, malt, hops, and barley, because are they not transformed?
No, they prefer to put water as their principal ingredient.
Right. Because that is the principal ingredient. It's an interesting one. But what you're telling me is that there isn't anything currently to state that anybody shouldn't be allowed to do that, but and that there is discussion on that.
Yeah.
My second point into that comes around water. So obviously, as Richard alluded to, if water is added post-fermentation to dilute your cider from 7% down to 6% alcohol, it's likely that will be the second ingredient on the list after apple juice, fermented apple juice, or cider. What if somebody were to add water pre-fermentation? Would that water need to appear on the ingredients list? So
I will suggest that if we refer to Jean-Pierre Stassen, who is the chair of the technical committee of AICV, he would include water even if it was added at the pre-fermentation stage, as well as in the fuller label. Yeah, because he would say that if you were to use fermented apple juice base or fermented cider base, you couldn't actually use it without breaking out what the compounds were in it. So if it was water, that would have to be stipulated.
Okay, super. Just a couple of technicals. Yes,
okay.
Hi Lorraine. Hi.
If I could just say, please. Hi. I'm sure Richard can add to this, is that all ingredient labelling is done as the mixing bowl. And if at the mixing bowl you have a compound ingredient, so an ingredient that's made up of other ingredients, then those ingredients are also listed. So you might have, I'm trying to think of a good example. If you add butter to a product, to a baking mixture, after the butter there'll be in brackets milk, salt, and the ingredients that make up the butter. So that's where you get your compound ingredient that might be your fermented apple juice with other things, and then the other ingredients.
I'll just come in there, Lorraine, if I may. I totally agree with that analysis. You could therefore have a product where the apple juice itself pre-fermentation was diluted, but That then becomes, as Lorraine rightly said, a compound ingredient. You could also have water added to the fermented compound ingredient at the end.
Yeah.
Quite possible. And if you did, you'd probably end up, the rules on this are that you'd probably, the best way to do it would have water twice in the ingredients list. So you've got your diluted apple juice with apple, open brackets, apple juice, water, close bracket, next ingredient is probably water. Now, it is possible to combine the two waters if that makes practical sense. So some people will break down all the compound ingredients. Instead of having brackets after the compound ingredient, they'll get rid of the brackets, break everything down, including compound ingredients, add together the various ingredients that have salt, and just have salt appearing once in the list at its correct position, because you have to declare everything in descending order of weight at the mixing bowl stage. But I think with cider, that would, if in this hypothetical example, you fermenting diluted with water, apple juice, then adding more water at the end, you'd be best off declaring the apple juice water mix as a compound ingredient. I'm not sure what would you call that ingredient though, because a compound ingredient has to have a name. So I'd be slightly struggling. Yeah, I suppose you could get away, because bear in mind the name of an ingredient has to be the true name of that ingredient. So if that ingredient was a food in its own right, it would need a true name of the food, and the same would apply to where it appears in an ingredient list. So I'll be quite honest, I didn't know that people diluted the juice prior to fermenting. I don't know.
I'm not necessarily saying that a lot of people do,
No.
but I suppose, I'm saying leave complex questions till the end, and I'm the one introducing them. So there's definitely more investigative things to do there. But we'll park there. But it was just an interesting one for me. We're going to quickly go back to Phil's question, which was around is there any are trading standards officials from around the country all singing from the same song sheet? I've been told by my local Newport South Wales trading standards that my alcohol declaration should read 6.5% ABV.
No. Look, anyone can look it up in the food information regs, okay? That will refer you to the EU directive that we're still bound by, and it hasn't changed from the 1996 food regulations, which were specific British regulations. The EU regulation that we've got a statutory instrument, so it's still applicable in this country. As Bob said, it says it's the number to 1 decimal point followed by the percentage sign followed by vol. It's quite clear, and I can double check that, and I'll get back to you, Gabe, if somehow something snuck up behind me and I haven't spotted it, but I can't see there being a regulation changing that format. You do see a lot of, I've noticed a lot of craft beer products, IPAs and so on, that get the declaration wrong. It's not the end of the world. I wouldn't say that's the most serious. I mean, it's much more serious to get your ABV declaration wrong, so that you give people the wrong strength, than the wrong format. But to stick to the format is obviously designed for clarity's sake.
Yeah.
But I'll double check that, but I think they're wrong. Whoever's told your person that, no, it had to be ABV, that isn't correct.
Okay. What they told me was you had to say the full word, alcohol by volume. That's what they wanted.
Well, they're wrong to say that, Phil.
Okay.
Yeah. As I said, you've got so 1 decimal point. In front of that, you can put the word alcohol or the abbreviation ALC, A-L-C. Okay, so the longest way of putting it is alcohol 6.9% vol.
Okay.
So you don't put 6.9% vol alcohol by volume. Okay, that's not how you do it. Seriously,
Thanks for clarifying that one, Rich.
101% sure on that.
No. Tony, we're going to come to your question a little bit later, if that's all right, because I want to stick around some of the more on-label messaging themes. Bob, could you give us an update about responsible drinking messages? Obviously, cider was really, when these really came to the fore, I think it was when I was sort of first getting into the bigger part of the industry, 2006, 7, 8. Cider was a very strong, proud and quick adopter of the responsible drinking messages. But over the last 5 years or so, there have been a lot of changes. And so what's the current recommendation from the NACM for what cider makers could or should be undertaking in terms of responsible drinking messages?
From the various government agencies there exists, it is should and ought to be putting the information on. There's a change in 2016 whereby I'm not going to use the word limits. The recommended usage of alcohol, instead of being 28 and 14, 28 for men, 14 for women, should be brought down to 14 units per week for everybody, because there was growing evidence to suggest that there was no difference between men and women as regards the effects which alcohol had on the body. Therefore, you should limit your consumption. That Public Health England advice got adopted by the other devolved administrations, and the Department of Health, before it was called Health and Care, Social Care, had a meeting with the industry, leaders of industry, to say we'd like to change the messaging that was already on bottles, on cans, to a different format. Instead of 5 principal messages, they're going to be happy with only 3 principal messages. Continue the units, so have the unit value of your drinks on the label. Continue with the pregnancy logo. You can continue with the drink aware logo, but there are issues relating to that because there's a copyright issue with drink aware.
You have to actually have to be a member in order to legally utilize it, right?
But I think there's a way around it which they're happy to work with.
Okay.
But the most controversial request was for the Chief Medical Officer's message of you shouldn't drink more than 14 units a week also to appear on the label. Now, the reason for that is a number of drinks manufacturers are multinational and didn't want to have a specific UK message because other countries have different types of requirement and limitations regards your ability to drink so many units per week. And therefore they didn't feel that it was appropriate that a UK health message should appear on labels that were sent to Japan, Singapore, or the United States. But there was an agreement tacitly that those such messages about the CMO's, Chief Medical Officer's message, could appear on a website. So that agreement was 2017, but you know, they keep chipping away at you, trying to wear you down. And I suppose industry's capitulated and will put the Chief Medical Officer's message on label. So that message will become more and more prominent now as we go forward. So the pregnancy logo, which has always been there, is required to stay there. The unit information must remain there. And then you'll find that the Chief Medical Officer's message will, again, become more and more prominent on labels. But it's only 3.
But to absolutely clarify, this is ought and should and not a legal requirement. Is that correct?
There is no law. It is an ought, should. A lot of media, social pressure.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. So it's up to the cider maker to decide whether they want to undertake best practice with regards to this and undertake the 3 points. It's very specifically the panel, the Chief Medical Officer's guidance that actually takes up the vast majority of the room, doesn't it? The number of units inside a bottle, the pregnancy logo are relatively minimal in terms of their impact in terms of space. It's the CMO guidelines that does take up quite a large proportion of the space there. So it's Whereas 10 years ago, there was a very clear and concise uniformity across all cider brands, bigger and smaller, adhering to the exact same messages. There seems to be a much greater divergence and mix and flow of people utilizing different mixes and different combinations because of the change in the guidance and things that are going on.
Well, we were allowed to sell out existing labels, which had the 5 messages on, to say a couple of years whilst they sold through their stock, and then time allowed to put the new label on if they're going down that route.
Yeah. Just I will get round to these symbols. There's a question here around about the vegan symbol. Jill, do you mean very specifically as the, you know, from the Vegan Society?
Yeah, it's like a green sort of corn thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Castle use it.
But I believe that's like an accreditation. So that's something that if you want, it's a bit like the Soil Association.
Yeah.
If you want to have an accredited endorsement that your product is suitable for vegans, then that is, you can gain that endorsement as a price. I'm sure that you would be audited, etc. But Bob, are you able to state that your product is gluten-free and suitable for vegans and vegetarians based upon the fact that it is just made from apples, and from the best of your knowledge, it has not got any animal products or gluten products in there? Can
I jump in? There is definitely a background rule on this that you shouldn't make claims that are effectively meaningless. So a product that you simply wouldn't expect to have any animal products in it, and no other product on the market that fits broadly into that category would have animal products in it. They don't particularly want you putting vegan signs on there, okay? That's my understanding, and it's certainly true with gluten-free claims, where a gluten-free claim, as you know, it doesn't literally mean gluten-free. It's something like below 20 parts per million. But again, if there's a foodstuff that no one has ever used gluten in, it's not recommended that you put gluten-free. Now, I'd have to check, and maybe Robert could come back on this, as to whether that is a hard and fast rule or whether it's simply best practice. But you see my point. They don't want people overusing these symbols when they're meaningless, because no one would expect the product to have gluten in.
I think, Richard, you give the consumer far greater credit than they have. Because
I met some stupid ones, mate, I'll tell you.
Because of the fact that cider is most commonly presented more like a beer, you know, single serve, carbonated, crown cap, similar ABV, you would be, I'm telling you now, there are considerable numbers of consumers who might well assume that cider does contain gluten. I'm telling you that now. So the fact, and also, you know, although there isn't a great heritage of animal fining products being used in ciders, they can be. And so when it's not, it is something that, because gluten-free, and because especially the move to veganism and vegetarianism is being undertaken much more greatly over the last 5 years from a lifestyle point of view, as much as anything else, that it is turning into a USP. So just to clarify, it's people are entitled and have the ability to do so without any recourse. That's just what I wanted to check. If you then wanted to...
Lucy's just confirmed that she gets people asking that. So I find that extraordinary, but maybe I'm overestimating the knowledge. That principle, by the way, does hold true, but of course you can make exceptions. I mean, if someone could make a case for saying, no, it genuinely informs the consumer, the average consumer is going to get information that it affects their transactional decision in a positive way. They avoid something they don't want. They might be attracted to something they do want. Then that principle, I think, would just go out the window, to be honest. But there are certainly products where you wouldn't expect gluten to be in there ever under any circumstances. So they don't want, and that's quite specific. I think it's certainly specific to the gluten regulations, because they have their own regulations, by the way, even though gluten is an allergen, or at least the cereals containing gluten are allergens, but we don't need to worry about the cider makers. So beer makers do not list contains gluten. They have to say contains wheat and barley or whatever, because they are the gluten containing cereals. Now, certainly in the gluten regs, they don't want to see gluten-free products on products that no one in their right mind would expect to have gluten in, because it might give them a marketing advantage. But then you'll say, well, there you go. That almost makes your point, Gabe, that someone's going to look at that and go, oh, great, it's gluten-free. I'll buy that one and not that one, even though neither of them have gluten in, and you wouldn't expect them to have gluten in. They never have had. So it's just that point, if you start making claims that are effectively, by all reasonable standards, ludicrous,
I would genuinely disagree with you on this one, because I don't think it's not doing anything ludicrous. It's just stating something that is true, that has gained consumer significance where it didn't previously. So whether you or I think that it's ludicrous for anybody to think that there's gluten within apple juice with cider isn't my question. My question is, can cider makers legally make the claim suitable for vegans and vegetarians on the label?
Well, interestingly, I'll come back on that, because there's one person who I do trust. She's an ex-trading standards officer. She now works for the Wine and Spirit Association, I believe.
Yeah, Noah. Yeah.
Kelly.
Yeah.
Kelly. Yeah. Now, I've got to be careful how I put this, but she pointed out a product. It was a spirit that was claiming it was gluten-free. And she said, and I wish I could find the email now, and I'd read it out to you. I might send it to you because it's quite interesting. And she said this spirit should not be making that gluten-free claim, because no spirits of that type, it was a clear spirit, would have gluten in it. None of them. So unless it's almost like saying, well, so I'm turning this argument on its head. No, let's just pick on vodka. No vodka has gluten in it, so they don't want certain manufacturers putting gluten-free, because it might imply to the uninformed consumer that other vodkas did have gluten in. So you see, that's turning the argument on its head. It's showing you that you can mislead by giving too much information that ultimately is meaningless in the context of vodka. No vodka has gluten in it. And even if it was made with a gluten-containing cereal, the distillation process breaks down that gluten, so you know it's simply not there in the finished product in a way that's going to harm celiacs or people with intolerance.
Well, so it's obviously this is something where there is some conjecture and there's some sort of debate about it. Certainly, the term suitable for on the vegan and the vegetarian side, rather than necessarily the gluten-free, is certainly something that I see a lot of cider makers utilizing as part of their narrative. Lead not being utilized so much these days, thankfully. The old Devon colic, not quite so bad as it was.
Thanks, Tony. Nice one, mate.
I'm going to just touch on something very briefly, because I don't think we've quite got time, and it probably encompasses a whole other issue, which is around the Portman Group, which is the organisation that sort of polices the way that cider and all alcoholic beverages are marketed, ensuring that it doesn't use particular language or typography or design which can undertake certain activities which are not allowed upon the code. Anything that could overly promote or accentuate the strength of the cider, let's say. Even 10 years ago, there were still a lot of ciders in the marketplace that utilized the word strong very boldly, and especially in emboldened letters upon their ciders. They don't do that so much. Bob, I think we might save that almost for a separate session at some stage. But are there any kind of like just one or two key fundamental things that people might get caught up in that they should be aware of?
It's free cider.
Bob, anything, any one or two sort of key headline things that people should be aware of as to the things that might catch them out, that they should, is it like placing the word strong very clearly on the label? Is that a challenge?
We don't have a definition for strong. The Treasury keep creating definitions for strong. For cider, it was 7.5, and they reduced it to 6.9. But Public Health England, in their alcohol health survey, have put strong at 6% ABV. So there is no definition of strong. So I would avoid it. To have descriptors like that are really pretty meaningless. The actual meaningful number is the ABV number, because the ABV of beer and of cider can be easily checked and say, oh, right, beer's 3.5 and or 4.5, and cider's whatever number you put. Then you make your own judgment. I mean, strong is a relative claim. It's not an absolute claim. It's all relativity. There's no point where you can actually say that's strong.
The point being was that if the term strong was being utilized as the predominant language upon a label, then there have been instances where that has made cider makers speak.
Yeah, well, the Portman Group have picked up companies that have made a point of saying that their product is strong, extra strong, because they're putting emphasis on the strength. And if you do that, then the Portman Group code comes into play. And that's another issue, but it is there. And the Portman Group will pick up your product, give it to the independent complaints panel. And if they uphold the complaint about the overemphasis on the strength of the product, then that product will get a red card.
Yeah, super. Okay.
And not be allowed to be sold in retail outlets.
Super. We're as I stated at the start, it's amazing how time flies, and we're whizzing through. There's plenty of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as possible. We'll keep the answers as snappy as possible as well, if possible. Richard, what is the allowable deviation from the stated % vol on the label?
Right, that's quite straightforward. For cider, it's plus or minus 1%. Now that is on analysis. I have to emphasize that. I'll try and keep this succinct, because what I don't want is people, they've printed thousands of labels up. They think, oh, this is stronger this year, but it's still within the 1%. Now that's playing the system a little bit. You probably wouldn't get prosecuted for it, because on analysis, it would still fit between plus or minus 1% of the stated ABV. So you stated at 6 on analysis, the analyst will pass that cider and the ABV declaration if it's anywhere between 5 and 7. Because of the high sugar content, it is actually not that easy, even in laboratory conditions, to get it absolutely right. So they've built that in, okay? So plus or minus 1% is the specific answer to that question. But don't play with it.
Yeah, but there's another issue. If you're under 70 hectolitres, it doesn't really apply. But the tolerance for HMRC, customs food, is much narrower than that.
It is.
And there are instances of labels that have underestimated or overstated the fact what the ABV actually is when we've analysed it. The product that you put on the label has to be really as close as possible to the actual quantity of alcohol there is, because HMRC will just go ape over it. So you've got to get your tolerances not to, oh, I'm allowed 1%, but closer to HMRC.
Yeah. I agree. I was just giving it from the legal food labelling point of view, but you're quite right. I'm aware that HMRC will work to much tighter tolerances, and it will affect the duty you pay or whatever. So yeah, be careful.
Richard, another quick question for you from Gray's Knee Cider. You mentioned that the 4 mil size there for the vol on the front, but apparently the FSA site says 3 mil for bites, e.g. 330 mil or 500 mil.
Yeah, there is, you're quite right. I haven't got the table in front of me, and I'm sorry, I'm not sad enough.
No, don't worry.
The height of those figures is very much dependent on the quantity. So, you know, if you're selling 20 kilogram bags, the 20 has to be much larger than it would if you were selling a 20-gram bag. Now, 4 millimeters, I thought that was for things that were over 200 mil, but it might be over 500 mil. Again, this is a Google thing. These days, you don't have to look up the legislation, all right? It's in weights and measures legislation. I wouldn't expect people to wade in through that, but you'll have some guidance from some local authority giving you the height of the figures. No one's likely to get prosecuted over that, frankly, but it's simply to try and make sure that important mandatory information is legible. Lucy asked a question very quickly, if I can deal with that. Does it all apply to sort of tax-exempt people under 7,000 litres? Yes, it does. The food labelling regs don't discriminate between how much you produce in a year. And the other question I saw coming up quickly, if I can nail that, was if something's wrong from a trading standards perspective, what do we do? Well, that's going to depend on what it is. We're not robots here in trading standards. If it's not a safety issue, then there used to be a phrase called the indulgence of the inspectorate. So I put out a message saying, yeah, look, don't bother me with this trivial technical breach. I'm aware of it. They'll get it sorted out in the next print run. And to be quite honest, an incorrect format for an ABV declaration would probably fit that bill, okay? No one's going to be jumping up and down if you get that wrong. We would expect you to get it right the next time you do a new print run or what have you. So I hope that answers that question.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any final questions at all from people? Are they want to put your hand up? If you, Mr. Rich Toft, please do. We can't hear you, sir. Take your unmute yourself.
Sorry. It was just a little question about trading standards prosecutions, really. Is it right to say that the people who will prosecute you if you do anything wrong is your local trading standards officer? So basically, if the local trading standards officer asks you to do something slightly different to what Richard said, do it. Because if they've told you to do it, and yeah, it might be technically wrong, but then there is no comeback on you.
Well, that's a complicated one. I mean, yes. If your product, Richard, turned up in Aberdeenshire and there was something seriously wrong with it, it wouldn't be me, the Aberdeenshire people. What would actually happen in practice, of course, they wouldn't, unless it was a serious breach, they'd contact me as your home authority. All right, they'd have a word with me and say, look, have you been advising this? What have you advised them? So it's very rarely that two trading standards departments disagree with each other. It has happened. I'm not saying that the law is full of grey areas and people can take different interpretations. It would be trading standards that took issue with you if it was a food labelling issue and not a taxation issue, obviously. But normally, unless it was very serious, they'd contact us and say, what's happened? What have you advised? Oh dear, they haven't followed your advice. And then it would be up to them what they usually, if it's not too serious, they just say, you need to re-advise them. You need to re-advise them. Okay? There haven't been, I've got to say, there haven't been many prosecutions that I can think of cider makers, certainly not in Herefordshire. There was one who was abusing the PGI a few years ago, based over in Birmingham, that got prosecuted because it certainly wasn't Herefordshire farmhouse cider they were making. And they actually did get prosecuted. And I hope that answers you.
Can I come in for Richard? NACM, National Association of Cider Makers, has a primary authority arrangement with Devon, Somerset and Torbay. And it's like the old home authority principle, whereby there's a centre of expertise that people can fall back on in the event of niggling inquiries or uncertain inquiries, where the advice isn't necessarily being understood by, say, a Derbyshire county councillor who has no idea about cider. Because it applies also to environmental health officers who sort of have very tough stipulations with regard to hygienic conditions of certain premises. So we've established that. So there shouldn't really be, going forward, contrary, ambiguous or arbitrary determinations by TSOs.
So Bob, the question is, how do cider makers get a hold of that guidance from the primary authority to ensure that they're doing things in line with that primary authority. So should any other local authority say you're doing this, they can just go, well, look at this piece of paper, that will tell you otherwise.
You don't even have to do that at this moment. I mean, I don't know where Richard is, but I assume
Worcestershire.
You've established a relationship with your TSO in Worcester.
Sorry, like I say, I was going back in some respects to Phil's comment about the way it was being stated to write the alcohol content down, and the discussion Richard was saying that no, it's wrong. The real comment was if he's being told by his authority to do it that way, that's the way he should do it, and he won't have any come back from the rest of the country.
The straightforward is, assuming that person is actually based in Newport and feels that the Newport TSO has not got it right, you would expect the company to talk to its trade association and say, I feel this isn't quite right, and that the trade association would deal with the matter on behalf of the member, because it's a straightforward matter of bringing information to the TSOs wherever they might be about what is going on in the rest of the country. So that's that type of approach. You bring it to someone's attention to try and get a resolution.
Yeah,
very good.
I've got a question about Gray's knee. They seem to be worried about something which I don't think's been resolved for them. If you don't mind me
What was the question, Gray's knee?
18 plus, and I'm not sure, there's no need to put 18 plus on labels or anything like that.
We thought it was something to do with the Portman groups.
No, drop it. You don't need to do that.
No, if we're talking about 18 plus only with regard to age gating on your website. If you've got a website, you must actually have a gate through which those under the age of 18 cannot pass, notwithstanding the fact that they know how to count and can bypass it anyway. But it's 18 is a purchase limit age covered by licensing law and a market control measure vis-a-vis the Portman Group. It's nothing to do with product labels.
No, agreed.
To be honest, I think there's still quite a lot of questions and quite a lot of things to run through, and we haven't got time in this session. So I'm going to propose that if Richard, Bob and Lorraine have the inclination and opportunity to maybe do a part 2 of this, I'll give you a little break, at some stage in the not too distant future, because I think there's been a huge amount of very important and very useful information here to have clarified, and great to have some discussion too. We still haven't covered off PGI, to delve a little more into primary authority. Phil has asked about, what we've talked about thus far has all been on bottled package, nothing about draft packaging. We haven't talked about the Portman Group, and around something that I would like to call, which is honest language, but again, it involves a little bit more of an informed conversation. So we have been going over an hour, so I think I am going to call time here, but to say thank you all for participating. Bob, Richard, Lorraine, thank you very much again for your time. I will get in touch with you all and everybody to suggest when the round 2 of this might be. It might well be in about 4 or 6 weeks time, possibly, but I'll check dates with everybody to see if you're able. So
yes,
absolutely fascinating. I've made reams of notes myself, and I don't even sell cider. But it's just fascinating, and it's really good information and knowledge for me. So guys, thank you all so very much. Happy Tuesday. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the not too distant future. So have a lovely evening.
Yeah, cheers everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers, thank you very much.
And goodbye. Cheers.
Boy.